Greetings everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian in southwest Portland along Barber Boulevard. And well, that Italian food place is closed. Anyway, that's not relevant to our story today. So this is a story I've wanted to cover for a long time. It was technically the inspiration for my whole Historic Murders of Portland series, and yet even though I've done almost 100 videos in that series, this is not one of them. This is going to be part of my Mystery Murders series because I feel like it's of a little too much substance to be a Historic Murders of Portland episode. So we are here at the 3600 block of Southwest Condor Avenue, which technically this used to be First Avenue, generally where First Avenue would go in. First Avenue ends kind of right there. It doesn't actually cross, and after crossing it becomes Condor Avenue. But back in 1924, this would have been First Avenue. So I'm taking you back to 1924, specifically April 1924, and this area looked a lot different. That house was probably here, those houses up there were, so a lot of the west side of this street is still intact, but this side, which used to have houses, is nothing like it used to be. Everything is gone. And a major part of that was, simply put, urban renewal. So I wanted to get this about as in line as I could, using old visuals, old maps, trying to discern where exactly 884 First Street in 1924 would be today, and it would approximately be 3716 Southwest Condor Avenue. Now, more towards, this is the south edge of this building, so more towards where this is the north edge of the building, so more this area would have been roughly where the house at that address would have been. And that home that once stood there, and it was kind of, I always just called it a barn house as a kid because it had kind of the general barn shape and, you know, kind of that Amityville horror house kind of look to it. But in April 1924, the Gratkes lived here, and there was a brief series, couple episodes on YouTube done by a few local historians, J.D. Chandler, rest in peace, and J.B. Fisher, and they did 4 episodes, and the first one that I saw was their story about a certain individual that was part of the Gratke family that lived here. And watching that episode and watching that little series really was the first thing that got me genuinely interested in, because I was always interested in crime from like the 60s and the 70s, but that got me interested in really early Portland crime, which is the whole substance to my Historic Murders of Portland series. It's all murder cases pre-1940, of which this one counts too, because it was 1924. So that episode, that first one that I saw about this particular case, is what really kind of inspired and spawned a whole series that I did. Now, living here at the Gratke home, there was a 15-year-old girl named Martha Gratke. She had 2 siblings, a younger brother and a sister, and a mother. Now, the mother had to work to support the family. The father, as seems to be the case in a lot of these random stories, the father kind of wasn't really that involved with the family, and it seemed like he was kind of a deadbeat, to be honest. And because Martha and the kids, their mom had to go work and make a living to support them, Martha was attending high school, and she actually dropped out so that she could be home here to kind of keep up the house and, probably most importantly, watch over the kids. That brings us to April 22nd, 1924. So it's the mid-afternoon, of April 22nd. And Martha is home. Again, it would have been generally in this vicinity right here. She was home by herself. Her mom was at work, her siblings were at school, she was at home tending house, essentially. And her brother comes home from school, and he notices the front door is locked, but apparently doesn't make too much of it. He just goes around and gets into the house another way. And he apparently sees nothing out of the ordinary when he gets home. He doesn't see Martha, but he doesn't see anything strange. And he just kind of wanders off and does what young boys do. So a short while after that, Martha's sister Louise also comes home. She too comes to the front door and discovers it's locked. This concerns her to a degree, and she too has to find another way into the house. Unlike Martha's brother, when Louise gets into the home, she ventures into the kitchen area and discovers one of the most grisly murder crime scenes in the history of Portland, especially considering it involved a 15-year-old girl. Martha Gratke laid there dead. She had been strangled. She had been beaten with a fireplace poker. She had been hit so hard that the fireplace poker was discovered broken into two and was just laying on the floor near her body. And beyond that, a butcher knife was used to stab her with. And that butcher knife was discovered sitting on a counter in the kitchen, only a couple of feet from Martha's dead body. And as it was reported, she had also been sexually assaulted. I saw some wavering in newspapers, and maybe they just didn't want to have to mention that detail, but it was mentioned in some that she had in fact been sexually assaulted as well. So this was a horrific, brutal, grisly crime, the likes of which were not that common, not just here in Portland, but in general. This wasn't just a shooting. This wasn't just a stabbing. This was a bludgeoning and a stabbing and a choking and a sexual assault, all rolled into one. It seemed like whoever came into that house either really wanted to kill brutally Martha Gratke specifically, or it was just someone who was absolutely out of their mind and looking for someone to attack, and they just happened upon Martha's home. I don't really know if I buy that story as much as the idea that this was someone who was actually targeting Martha. And it was just a horrendous crime scene to stumble onto. And there were witnesses to a suspicious individual in the area who looked generally kind of disheveled. Some witnesses said he had apish qualities. He was kind of this lumbering, transient ape-looking guy. That was kind of, in fact, in the episode that J.D. Chandler and J.B. Fisher did on this, the episode was called The Apish Brute, because the guy was described as being somewhat apish looking. And this individual was seen walking the street right here in front of the Gratke's home. In fact, one person said that they saw him kind of slowly meandering down the street, and he kind of looked up at the Gratke home, kind of wondering if that was where he was maybe supposed to be, and then kind of meandered and then kind of came back. And it appeared in that vein that this individual was actively looking for the home where Martha Gratke, or at least the Gratkes specifically, lived. On the other hand, there was another witness. Now, it seems to me they were probably mistaken, because all the other witnesses suggested that this individual was kind of loafing around out front and then went behind the Gratke home. There were witnesses that said they actually saw him walk alongside the house and go into the area that would be their backyard. There was one witness in one newspaper that, on the other hand, specifically said that they saw this individual out front, and then he walked up to the front door, knocked on it, and Martha willingly let him into the house, either because she was naive and didn't feel she was in danger, or possibly she knew this individual. Now again, that was only one report in one newspaper. It seems everyone else stated that this individual they saw went around to the back side of the house. The idea being that he wanted to sneak in through the back way and attack from behind. and maybe no one would see him. He was loitering out front though, so people were going to see them, and in fact did. And the fact that there's a couple old houses just right up over here, I'm wondering if some of the witnesses actually lived in some of these very few houses that are still here. There's like 2 or 3 old houses up here, and everything else here is completely different. Now, this transient, like apish looking individual was seen in the vicinity of the Gratke home and going around back and presumably entering the home. Now, since both of Martha's siblings both acknowledged the front door was locked and that they had to get in other ways, they could have just walked in through the back door, and the back door could have been left unlocked, giving this guy no obstruction to get into their home. But because of how this area in general was at the time, again, a lot of what was here has been drastically changed thanks to urban renewal events, specifically during the late 50s and 60s. All of this changed, so it's much different today than it was back in 1924. But this was a much rougher kind of working class area, rich with cultural history. But there were a lot of homeless people and transients that kind of lingered in this area. And so, I mean, it's not really much different now. There's lots of homeless people seen all over this city. To see homeless people walking around is nothing out of the norm, and it wasn't really out of the norm to see that in this area in 1924. So when people saw this transient kind of meandering about, seemingly aimlessly, and then kind of wandering to the back of the house, they maybe didn't feel like they had much to worry about because they were so used to seeing people like that in the area. This individual didn't, it seemed, give local neighbors a real dire reason to feel like somebody in the Gratke home might become endangered. Little did they know what this individual was about to do to this girl. And he was seen out here, again, it was about a half hour before the body was discovered. And of course, she laid here dead up until her sister found her. And, I almost wonder what would have happened had this individual shown up a little bit later. And not only was Martha Gratke home, but her siblings were home. Would this individual have killed those children as well? Either out of some blind rage he was experiencing, or more specifically, if he had a specific reason to kill Martha Gratke, or even beyond that, would have a reason to be tied potentially to that murder, he might kill her siblings just so there wouldn't be any witnesses. But fortunate or unfortunate, he showed up just a little while before Martha's siblings came home, and they were only here to discover the horrible aftermath. And there were a lot of suspects that came up in this case, and of course, Martha's own father at least briefly became a person of suspicion, and he was kind of known to be not a real super seedy character, but let's just say they had suspicions about him, and he was kind of removed from the family. They didn't really have much connection. And while this search was on to try to find the father, at least to verify whether he could have been involved or not, he finally was found, and he was briefly looked into as a suspect, but it was determined pretty quickly that he was not the one responsible for what happened here. I mean, what an insane crime that would be, to just go so long without seeing your kids, not even really being in their lives, almost like you don't care, and then just suddenly you show up one day and just brutally and violently and horridly murder your own daughter. It seems really kind of bizarre, and like it wouldn't make a lot of sense under the circumstances, because again, it just didn't seem, when you're a father who's kind of off over here somewhere, not really involved in your kid's life, are you really going to care that much about what happens to your kids one way or another? It didn't seem like a guy like that would be the type that would just suddenly show up one day and do something psychotic like that. So as is always the case, pretty much, especially with high-profile crimes like this, you get a lot of interesting possibilities. And in the aftermath of the Martha Gratke murder, as authorities tried to figure out who this mysterious, transient-looking individual was, little possibilities began to trickle in. One was a guy who picked up a guy, I assume hitching, near Hubbard, which is kind of near Salem, Oregon, a little ways south of Portland. And the man that picked this guy, who he never got a name, the guy that he picked up said that he admitted he was a transient and he had recently come from Portland. So there wasn't really anything to tie him to the case. It was just intriguing to this individual that right after this Martha Gratke girl gets killed by someone who looks like a transient, here's this guy that, admits he was in Portland recently, and since he's south of Portland, traveling south, it almost seems like, is this guy trying to, get out of town? You'd think the guy would be smart enough if he was the guilty party. You'd think he'd be smart enough to not admit, oh yeah, I'm a transient and I'm fleeing from the town where a transient just killed a 15-year-old girl. Nothing to see here. And that didn't really materialize because, again, this, I don't even think the driver got the name of this guy. So he just kind of picked him up, drove him somewhere, left him off, and we have no idea who that individual was. Another individual that was picked up briefly was a guy named Arthur Fleming, who was a guy that generally seemed to match the description that was given for this guy. And he was doing working odd jobs along First Avenue here. We're just a little way south of the Gratke home. Along First and then Second Avenue would be a little block over. And so he'd been working in the area, and when they say he matched the description, I can only assume he was probably kind of a transient worker that was just doing odd jobs around here just to get him a room for the night and a little food in his stomach. So because of his appearance and because he was kind of working generally in the vicinity of where the murder happened, Fleming became briefly a person of interest and was also ultimately dismissed, couldn't be tied to the crime. But the first real possible solid person was this individual named W.C. McCann. And McCann was living in Salem in early May, and on May 8th he was apprehended by authorities, so about 2.5 weeks after Martha Gratke was killed. McCann was grabbed primarily because it was thought maybe this guy has a connection to the Martha Gratke case. And essentially what brought McCann to the attention of authorities was a bunch of bloody rags had been discovered in the room that he was staying at there in Salem. Now, when they say they'd been discovered, I can only assume maybe he was renting out a room and a landlady went in to clean it up, found some bloody rags, and, kind of freaked out. And McCann didn't really do himself a lot of favors when he was apprehended. He was kind of scatterbrained about things. He gave the police this really just kind of difficult to believe story that he just found these rags along some railroad tracks. He just found some bloody rags by some tracks and then decided to pick them up and bring them home with him. And it's if he'd had sustained an injury of some kind, cut himself with a tool, I don't know, and he got blood all over and he had to get some rags to clean the blood off, that's a believable story. But why wouldn't he just say that story? Why would he say something that's so ridiculous? Why would you pick up bloody gloves and take them home with you? I know people weren't quite as sanitary in the 1920s as they are now in the 2020s, but come on. And when they asked him, were you in Portland April 22nd, the day that Martha Gratke was killed, he couldn't even give them a clear answer on that. Obviously he'd been in Portland at some time, but he didn't know. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't, maybe I shouldn't admit that I was, because then that's just going to make me look more guilty. This guy was really kind of all over the place, which just made him look more suspicious. And what further didn't help this guy, other than the fact that he couldn't seem to figure out where he was, who he was, or what he was doing at any given moment, was he worked as a painter in Salem, and a fellow worker of his, a guy that was listed in the newspapers as being named M. Randolph, said that he was kind of a little put off by the fact that it seemed McCann was really genuinely interested in the Gratke case, and that he would probably keep newspaper clippings of it and stuff. And he said that he got the vibe from how McCann behaved in relation to the Gratke case that he, McCann, actually knew Martha Gratke personally. Now, he couldn't prove that, but that was the vibes he was getting. So here we've got a guy that seems oddly obsessed with this crime, and he can't get his story straight, and he's got bloody rags in his place with him. And as we know about crazed, sadistic killers, they tend to keep elements of their crime. Now, usually they'll like take something from the victim or from the victim's home. But I guess keeping bloody rags from the crime scene might just be another slightly more twisted way of keeping evidence from a murder you committed. So this intersection here is 1st and Sheridan, Sheridan being the crossing street, and this is the southeast corner. Back in 1924, there would have been a house, a rooming house, some kind of structure here. And upon extensive grilling with McCann in terms of were you in Portland or not, they found out that the day that Martha Gratke was killed, he was living at a rooming house at this corner, or a house of some kind at this corner of this intersection. Now this is 1st and Sheridan, and Martha Gratke's home is only about maybe 12-15 blocks that way. So not only was McCann actually in Portland at the time of her murder, but he was only blocks away. And so it seemed like they had a really solid suspect here. It really seemed like they had someone solid. You've got a guy who's, you've got bloody rags. You've got he was living in the town in close proximity the day it happened. You've got the guy can't keep a story straight. And he has this apparent, interest bordering on obsession with the case. Like, there are a lot of dots being connected here with this guy. And then when he's finally brought in and actually grilled about it, he's released and it's deemed he wasn't involved. Authorities determined that that was the case. And I see that so much in these old cases. There'll be a big hullabaloo, 2 or 3 days. It's like, here's the guy, we found him, look at all this evidence. And then in the snap of a finger, all of a sudden, no, it wasn't them. And there's never a reason given. Like, oh, well, he was in Alaska when this happened. Okay, if he's in Alaska, then fine. But it's just, there oftentimes is never a reason given. It's just, they're the big flavor of the week for a couple of days, and then all of a sudden they're just gone, and they were never involved. And, this is the 1920s. This was the heyday of corruption in the Portland police force. And I think someone as likely as McCann being the guilty party, it surprises me they didn't try to beat a confession out of him, which they did do with another possible suspect that I'll get to a little bit later. He was the guy, and then they let him go, and all of a sudden the trail was cold again. And then another name that came up, not because he necessarily lived in the area or maybe had a connection to the Gratkes or whatever, he was just a convenient guy to look at, which isn't to say he couldn't have possibly been involved. And that was a guy named John Arthur Pender. Now, I've referenced John Arthur Pender in at least a couple of videos. Some people thought he may have been responsible for murdering the Hill family, or not the Hill family, but they thought he may have been responsible for that, but he may have been responsible for this murder of a woman named Daisy Weirman and her son north of Portland. And John Arthur Pender is one of these guys that he's kind of like the Edward Edwards of like 1910s and 1920s murders. And if you don't know who Edward Edwards is he died a few years ago, but he was this he did kill some people. He was a bona fide serial killer. But people have tried to claim that he's like responsible for all of these really infamous crimes. They've said that he killed Sam Shepard's wife, this infamous case that The Fugitive is based on. They say he killed John Benet Ramsey, he killed Martha Moxley. They even tried to say he was the Black Dahlia killer, even though Edward Edwards was 13 at the time. So he's this guy that, like, every one of these random iconic cases happens, like, someone will try to plant it on him and make him take credit for it. And John Arthur Pender was this guy, he was a genuine creep. And he was looked at as a suspect in the Barbara Holtzman murder in 1911. And obviously as I mentioned, the Daisy Weirman murder, which I want to say happened the same year. I reference it in my Hill Family documentary. And yeah, he would just kind of come up conveniently. Now, that being said, there's two things in relation to Pender that make him at least kind of interesting in relation to the Martha Gratke murder. And it seems like he was kind of more or less in the Portland, if not the Oregon area. So he may have been in the general vicinity, but like, I don't know if I think he really did it, but there's two things that are of interest in this matter. One is, fast forward, like, he was already kind of a creeper, and he was busted in 1927 for trying to abduct a girl. And this girl also happened to be 15, just like Martha Gratke. So there was his behavioral patterns, if I can put it that way. Like, I think he totally would have seized an opportunity to go after someone like Martha Gratke. Especially if, say, he knew she was home alone. But beyond that, one of the witnesses who saw the transient out in front of the Gratke home, Mrs. E. Miller, said that when she saw an image of John Arthur Pender, I assume in a newspaper, that she said, she couldn't be 100% certain, but she said he looked exactly like the guy that she saw meandering around outside the Gratke home. And if you look at pictures of John Arthur Pender, I guess you could say he's kind of apish to a degree, and I think he was kind of leading periodically a somewhat transient life, so he may have looked kind of transient-ish in 1922. Most of the images I've seen of him are from the 1910s, so I don't know exactly how his appearance would have looked in not 1922, but 1924, when this murder happened. So there's interesting little tidbits that kind of make you want to look a little closer at John Arthur Pender. But aside from those thoughts and theories, there's not really anything else to go on. Nobody ever put him in the vicinity of the home. No one ever suggested he maybe knew Martha Gratke. There was just nothing to tie him to this. But it was more because of the other things he was known to have done that made people consider John Arthur Pender. And I don't think he ever was arrested or faced any real serious police scrutiny on this matter to see if he was possibly involved. Which then leads us to fast forward even further to the mid-1930s, a decade since Martha Gratke was murdered, and still no suspects. Nobody knows exactly who was responsible for this. And a kind of beat up, middle-aged fella named Ira T. Miller comes into the picture, who was really kind of the last person who was looked into on this case. And it was in the mid-30s, I think it was 1935. So right smack in the middle of the 30s. So the Gratke case is more than a decade old, and they haven't found someone, and they're probably getting a little desperate. They obviously, were willing to use means that suggested desperation to finally solve this case. And again, even though it's the 30s now, the Portland police, there's a lot of corruption going on. And remember earlier when I was talking about Mr. McCann and how I was kind of surprised that he was, everyone thought it was him, and then immediately, boom, he was released. Well, Ira T. Miller was kind of the opposite. It's interesting, like McCann, Ira Miller was also a painter, coincidence, and he got busted and brought in. The police charged him with, drunkenness, which wasn't actually the case. They just needed something, they needed an excuse to bring him in and discuss this matter. And Ira T. Miller was kind of a convenient, I'm not saying this means he didn't do it, but he was kind of a convenient fall guy type to go after. Almost a little bit like John Arthur Pender, kind of a convenient guy to turn to, because Miller was just kind of this, you know, lumbering around, deadbeat alcoholic. And he was, you know, he was just always getting into random trouble. He was always getting into fights with someone. There's always something going awry with this guy. And it's interesting because something that they, again, in the video that J.D. Chandler and J.B. Fisher did when they discussed Ira Miller, J.D. Chandler mentioned, hey, you know, they say that the guy that was seen outside of Martha Gratke's house was, you know, apish looking, and then you see Ira Miller and he looked kind of like an ape. Like, he had a very big and a long head, and his ears were huge, and he had kind of these sleepy eyes and this very kind of smirking grin. Now, the only image that I've seen of him was from like 1921, so it was him when he was a little bit younger than he was. He was middle-aged, I want to say he was pushing 50, if not already there, by 1935 when they decided to try to bring him in. And it was this real farce. I think they just wanted to pin it on this guy. He's brought in, the police actually get him drunk, and they put him in a room that they have wired to record what he says, so they'll have this, you know, conveniently recorded confession, and they work him over, beat him up a little bit, which Ira Miller's used to at this time, and they finally literally beat a confession out of this drunken, you know, this guy who's just drunk out of his mind. And speaking of the police, they heard me talk. I don't know, maybe that's the police, but of course, Ira Miller came to later on, no longer drunk, and immediately, you know, when he either remembered what he said or it was brought to his attention what he said, he immediately denied it and said, like, well, you got me drunk and, you know, forced that out of me. That's not a confession, that's nonsense. And it did actually lead, or it was a really significant factor leading to a investigation that was done on Portland police conduct. And I love that I'm talking about this while there's all these sirens going on behind me. I think they know. And so the Ira T. Miller angle didn't really go anywhere because it was obvious the circumstances that were used to get a confession out of him. And, you know, it really made the police look bad. And specifically, yeah, there was a grand jury investigation of police conduct, especially in relation to the Ira T. Miller incident. So that didn't do the police any favors. And again, I think he was just a fall guy that they wanted to hopefully put this thing on and get somebody for it. And maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. There doesn't really seem to be anything to really put him there. Like, did he know Martha Gratke? We don't know. Was he in the area where she lived around that time? We don't know. Was he drunk that night? Probably. So, like the rest, Ira T. Miller ended up being one of those guys that got some attention, and, you know, maybe the public at least thought something was going to happen, and then he was, you know, ultimately released, and nothing really ever happened in relation to him on the case after that, just like all those that came before them. And the police came away with some egg on their face. I feel like they keep getting closer. And that was, you know, about 1935. So that was like the last real significant person of interest that came up in this case. And it was like they were so dead set on finally getting a resolution to it that they were willing to go to those lengths that got them, the police, in trouble. But then after Miller kind of faded away, so did the Martha Gratke murder. Maybe the police, you know, after having that investigation happen, maybe they realized, you know, or maybe they figured maybe it's not really worth going after that hard if it's going to cost us something like, you know, our reputation or whatever, as we tried to get this one guy on the matter, you know. But it's like, at the same time, the investigation happened because you did something horrible to somebody. So, one interesting thing I gleaned from JD and JB's video on the case that I hadn't found when I was trying to search for articles myself was an article they found that showed that Martha Gratke, who again was only 15, had frequented a place called the Balkan Club, which was called a soda shop, which this was the mid-1920s, so odds are they were selling booze and stuff out of there too. But it was so interesting because this was the notorious, it's Chinatown now, but this was the notorious North End back then. So it was kind of interesting to think that this random 15-year-old girl who lived on the southwest, like she lives the whole other side of downtown from here, that Martha Gratke would randomly be hanging out here. And the Balkan Club was said to be located almost right in the middle of these two buildings. Now this is the Synod House, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This place was built in the 1880s. This place was built, I forget the year, but it was pre-1924. So since they say it's right in the middle, I'm guessing the Balkan Club would have been right here, this little area where some of these, you know, obviously multiple businesses were in here. It would have been probably either this small one or this small one would have been where this Balkan Club was located. And, you know, there was all kinds of vice going on around this area. There was all kinds of illegal booze stuff going on, and various forms of vice were happening out of just about every establishment in this area. And the Balkan Club was probably no different. But here's what's interesting is the proprietors of that place that were referred to, at least in the video, they were referred to as the Dimitris, who owned the place there. They were neighbors with Martha Gratke and her family. So maybe that explains why she was randomly up here from, you know, at least seen here, all the way up here, the whole other end of town, and she's only 15. You know, on the one side you could say like, oh, they knew her, so she came there because she knew this was a safe place to go, potentially because her neighbors ran it. But there's other possibilities. And in the video that they did, they show a little article that shows that from the vicinity of the Balkan Club, right back there, a man who was described as kind of an unsavory North End character was seen to, it was thought, follow her after she left the club one night and was like kind of menacing her, potentially stalking her, following her home. And it didn't seem like they named who that individual was, but that kind of started adding a new dynamic to this, you could say, Balkan Club connection. Is this possibility that maybe that was somehow connected to her murder, or why she was here. If somebody was following her out of that place and she's just randomly visiting there, that person could have followed her home. You know, one of the witnesses said that the guy out, and this is what they discussed in the video, is that this guy that was actually seen there out in front of the Gratke home, it seemed pretty clear that he was trying to find her specific address. So could there be a connection there? Maybe. And JD Chandler also mentioned in that video that there had been like a major human trafficking ring going on in this area, and that was maybe somebody trying to suck Martha Gratke into that. Could someone have tried to do that? She could have outright said no, and then someone may have not taken very kindly to that refusal and may have taken their rage out on her. You know, I do find it interesting that again, how she was killed was so brutal. It seems like a bit much for some people that were trying to get her to agree to something and she said no. Like, I can understand someone killing over that, but the way it was done, unless they brought in somebody who was just a genuine nutbag psychopath, I don't know if that feels to me like a strong enough motive to brutally murder someone in such a horrible way. But still, it brought more to the table. It raised more things to think about. Was the fact that she was seen up here in an area that you wouldn't think she would be, like, was that potentially tied into why she was killed? Now, there's a number of possible theories one could put up to explain who the individual was, the motive that they likely had in going into the Gratke home and murdering Martha Gratke. Some, I think, are definitely stronger than others, and you know, that's a matter of how you look at it. I can look at a particular theory and say that one's ridiculous, that's the least likely of the bunch. Someone else over here can look at that and say, well, I actually think it's the most likely of the bunch because of this. There's really two possibilities that I think are the strongest and loom the highest above others, but it's important to address, you know, pretty much any possibilities, at least as far as I can see them realistically. And I feel like the least likely scenario, just to get it out of the way, was this was a random attack by a random attacker. This was a person who obviously was a sex fiend, again, to use kind of more of the terminology of the time, was maybe out looking for a victim, or maybe not, and just happened upon there. But that doesn't really make sense, because if you're not looking for a victim, why would you just randomly go up to somebody's home? And you know, this individual just happened to see the home, perhaps, you know, walked by it, looked in, and saw that it looked like there was, you know, maybe only Martha home, and that's why they walked past it, kind of gave it a look, thought it over, and then came back and ventured into the home and attacked her and killed her, and it was just a random attacking. I think that's the least likely possibility, because so many random things would have to come together perfectly for that to be the case. And again, the brutality of this murder is, I think, its greatest signifier as to the type of individual who was responsible. And this doesn't come off at all as a random attack. This comes off as a brutal, you know, a crime of passion is almost too weak of a description. But because of the brutality of it, this was not just someone that was, you know, putting out a hit, so to speak, as far as I'm concerned, which actually leads us to another possible theory, which is, and I know in J.D. Chandler and J.B. Fisher's video on this, they suggest the possibility, because they discuss why was Martha Gratke, who lives South Portland, she's only 15, why is she hanging out in the North End? Other than the fact that the Balkan Club, you know, the people that ran it were neighbors of hers and knew her. And, you know, was it possible that, you know, again, in addition to why was she up there, was it possible that she fell in with some people that tried to get her mixed up in something? For example, prostitution. And she said no, and that angered the wrong people. In addition to that, is it possible that maybe in that vein, did she maybe learn some information that maybe she wasn't supposed to know? Was she an individual that, you know, learned or knew too much? And under those possible circumstances, someone was sent to her home, essentially, to execute her. It's all very interesting, you know, pondering and wondering why this 15-year-old girl was spending so much time in a sketchy area that was very far from where she lived. But again, this particular murder case and the brutality of it does not scream of an execution, you know, to shut up a witness or take revenge against somebody who wronged you. Normally in that case, you keep it relatively simple. You know, shoot someone, stab them, poison them, set up circumstances that lead to an accident. But you don't take, I mean, whoever did this, like, they took time in committing this murder. They didn't just come in, boom, 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 book it out onto the street and the whole thing's over in, like, you know, 10 seconds. There was a lot more to this, and this just does not reek of a hit whatsoever. It's also important to remember that the assailant at least appeared to be a transient. Now, if Martha Gratke was being executed for some reason or another, I was thinking, like, why would they send a transient in to do the job? I know there was a lot of transients around Portland, but why would you put something so important on a transient, even if it's like you're grabbing a random guy and thinking, oh, I'll throw them some money to do this, and then they'll do it, and if anything happens, they get caught and they're probably not going to get tied back to us. Another angle is if somebody was executing her, they might intentionally look like a transient, so as to look like not only someone that wouldn't be associated with whoever was responsible, but also look like somebody that was common to the area, because there was transients all over that part of Portland. I don't think that strengthens the theory that she was executed, but it is important to at least ponder, like, was this really a transient, or was it maybe someone that made themselves to look like a transient so they would fit into the area? And then you leave and you shed that transient persona and you look just like another person in town, you might get away with nobody thinking it's you. That's at least something that needs to be considered. What brings me to, I think, the two most likely possible reasons, motives, as to why this killing occurred. And they're almost interchangeable to some degree. The first is she was killed by just, a sex fiend, but not a random killing. She was probably killed by a sex fiend or even someone who with pedophilic tendencies. She was still only 15. And in this case, it was more likely somebody who, again, possibly had met her and gotten to know her a little bit, and maybe gotten into her good graces, made her feel like that individual was trustworthy so that when they decided to do what they wanted to do, she wouldn't see it coming. It seems anybody that looked into this case figured that whoever went into the home, it was likely that Martha knew them. And even the police in the immediate aftermath, they said definitively, it was still their perspective, but they said definitively that Martha knew her attacker. Unlike the scenario where, say, it's a random sex fiend committing a random act, which is kind of hard to believe, this would more be something that was at least thought up, from the moment this individual meets Martha. They have that desire and they figure out, little details about her. They figure out where she lives, at least generally where she lives, because the individual that went into the home, one thing all witnesses could agree on was that he appeared to be looking for Martha's home. He was walking and kind of looking up at the houses. He walked like a little ways past it and then stopped, like, no, and then turned back and eventually went on to the Gratke's property. So whoever did this at least knew generally where Martha's home was, and you don't just pick that information out of the air. So they might figure out where she lives. They might figure out, oh, her mom's busy at work, her brother and sister are at school. There's this particular time during the day where Martha is home alone. And then she gets attacked and murdered shortly before her brother and sister come home. I don't think that was pure luck. I think this individual knew that she would be home alone at that time. And in all fairness, if you look at the sex fiend pedophile angle, that for most people circles us back to John Arthur Pender, who I addressed earlier. Again, John Arthur Pender, if anything pedophilic was going on in Portland during like the 1910s and 20s, John Arthur Pender would often be a primary suspect to consider. Which, it's possible he maybe was Martha Gratke's killer. I know in the book, the Man on the Train, which was written by Bill James, who wrote the book, the baseball statistics book that the movie Moneyball is based on. He wrote this book, I believe, with his daughter, and it was about their theory that this succession of murders that were happening all across the country were being done by this same individual. And he addressed murders in Oregon. He addressed the Hill family that was murdered in 1911. And he briefly touched on the Martha Gratke case. And Bill James reached the, at least as far as he was concerned, he figured John Arthur Pender was probably responsible for killing Martha Gratke. And again, John Arthur Pender may have done it. I'm not denying he could have, but he was also a very convenient person to look in on. And you know, it's one of these things. People nowadays, especially if you don't look back in history, they think a lot of these really nasty types of people are things that really didn't really come into prominence till, you know, the last 50, 60 years. And it's like they don't realize that serial killers and pedophiles and things like this have been around for a very long time. And pedophiles have always been an issue. And I literally did a brief newspaper search to prove my point. I looked up literally under Oregon newspapers for 1924, when Martha Gratke was killed. I looked up articles with the word pervert in them. I looked up, like, you know, sex fiend, sex pervert, things like that. In less than 2 minutes, I found an article about a guy in Salem who tried to, it was a pervert who tried to attack someone. I found a story that took place in Vancouver, like just doing a general search for that. And both these instances happened around the summertime when Martha Gratke was killed. So the fact that I, doing a general search like that, could find multiple instances of perverts going after, you know, underaged kids, so to speak, just goes to show how prominent creepy people like this were. And yet there's kind of this attitude that because he was kind of known and he went to jail for infamous crimes, there's kind of this notion that, like, John Arthur Pender was the only creepy guy walking around, you know, the Willamette Valley during the 1910s and 20s, and that's just not true. So while John Arthur Pender's a possibility, to just say, it was probably him, really serves to dismiss any number of creepers that may have been responsible, that didn't have a big name like he did. And I actually tried, unfortunately with no success, to look up right around that time when Martha was killed if there were any known people with, you know, a record of, you know, sexual perversion or something like that, that may or may not have fled the Portland area around that time. It was a stretch that I would find anything, but I thought, you know, if I can find someone who hasn't been considered, who would maybe commit a crime like this, potentially, and they fled the Portland area shortly after, that was unknown to the police at the time, that's a possible new suspect. But alas, nothing came up in that vein. The other angle that I think, and again, this can tie in, because this could have also been someone with pedophilic tendencies. This obviously could have been someone who was a sex fiend, again, to use that term. This is somewhat interchangeable with the angle that someone who was just a sexual deviant, who was maybe got to know her a little bit, or maybe was stalking her, and then learned just enough to be able to seize the moment and be alone with her and do what he wanted to her. I think this theory is even a little bit stronger than that. This is just my perspective. And that is that whoever was responsible for this was someone that not only maybe had deviant tendencies, not only maybe met Martha, took a little time to know her, got to know her well enough to know where she lived, know that she would be home alone at given times, but was someone that became, you know, potentially obsessively enamored of her. Now again, if you're just a sex fiend or a pedophile, that could happen, but I think this could have been very likely someone that developed an interest in her, maybe to a point of obsession, and tried to act that out, or tried to bring that to Martha's attention, and she flatly turned him down. And this murder was the vengeance that came as a result of that rejection. The argument then in that case is that this was a murder out of jealousy and retribution for being rejected. A lot of men during this time murdered women that they weren't even in relationships with, flatly because they rejected them. I could name out a succession of them that I've discussed. 1905, a guy named Frank Guglielmo killed a 16-year-old, not much older than Martha, named Freda Guaracia when she resisted his advancements. He went to her home and killed her. There was a guy named Fred Tronson several years later, much closer to when Martha was killed. He met this woman named Emma Ulrich while they were both working in the Lewis building. It was a building in Portland. He was an elevator operator. She got on the elevator one day. He saw her and fell in love. And he made numerous efforts to ask her out. He asked her to marry him, and she flat out rejected him numerous times until one night he tracked her to her home, waited for her to go home after she got off the streetcar from work, went into her home and killed her and fled. And there's other examples. Those are just two that happened during the earlier part of the 1900s. A lot of men who killed women that they weren't even in relationships simply because they rejected them. And a lot of these guys had little to no remorse. They felt like they had been wronged. It was kind of early incel behavior. There was this attitude that I wanted them, I was willing to show them all the love in the world, and they wouldn't accept that. And so they actually hurt me, so I was justified in doing what I did. You know, some of these men would be apprehended and make absolutely, they wouldn't even acknowledge for a second that they were responsible for any wrongdoing. Fred Tronson even made a point of stating in a rather kind of contemporary perspective that it wasn't his fault that he killed Emma Ulrich. It was the fact that people like him could so easily access guns. That was really what was responsible for it. So these guys would kill and take no responsibility. And for the record, guys like Frank Guglielmo and Fred Tronson all fled the city of Portland in the immediate aftermath of their attacks. They just were fortunately tracked down. So if it was someone like those guys that killed Martha Gratke, they could have done the same thing and split town immediately, only they were fortunate enough to actually get away from town. And I really feel like that revenge angle and, you know, almost shaming the male by rejecting him is the strongest angle to explain, at least try to explain and understand what happened. You have the brutality of the killing, which someone's not going to do if they're just robbing the place or if they're just killing her because she's a witness to something. There was a definite passion. Like, whoever did this was, you know, probably a sexual sadist to some degree. And a rejection can explain the brutality of it, the again, to use the term passion murder level of it. Whoever did this wanted to make sure that Martha suffered and died a painful death, and here she is, just this 15-year-old girl who's dropped out of high school to help take care of the house while her mom takes care of the family because her dad's split and off doing God knows what. I just feel like the revenge angle, you know, shaming the man, and so he's going to take out retribution on you because either how dare you do that to him, or he can't stand that you may someday be with another man. I think that explains the brutality of the attack. I think it can explain the, again, to use the term, the passion of the murder. Whoever did this wanted her to suffer and suffer greatly. And somebody who's just robbing the house and ends up killing her isn't going to do that. Someone who's just executing her because she knows too much about something isn't going to do that. Even a lot of various types of sexual deviants aren't going to go quite to these lengths. Some obviously would. But I feel like you add that element of rejection, of, you know, shaming a man. And again, you know, lots of men during this time in the Portland area killed women for the exact same reason. I just think that is the strongest possible motive in this case. And again, as far as suspects go, Pender, John Arthur Pender, we've talked enough about him. I've made my stance known on him. This individual, this unnamed individual that was picked up along the road and said he'd recently left Portland is certainly a possibility, but without an identity, there's no way to know. I feel like this McCann character, of the suspects that were actually considered, I think he's the strongest. And again, I never saw the reason why they just suddenly did a 180, said, we think we got our guy, we think we got our guy. Nope, he's not our guy. They never said, oh, well, he provided an alibi, or we found fingerprints that don't match his. There was never an explicit reason given for why he was suddenly dismissed as a suspect in the information I could find. Maybe there was something definitive in there, but here's a guy that, you know, kind of wouldn't say where he was, and then finally admitted he was in Portland at that time. He was staying at a location just blocks from the Gratke home, and then he quickly leaves Portland shortly after, and one of these guys that he's around says, like, oh, we had this weird interest in the case, and he had this, you know, weird bloody garment that he claimed he just picked up and brought home with him. Like, who would do that? So certainly as far as evidence goes, I feel like he was the strongest of the known suspects. And honestly, I really think whoever did this is probably someone who's never, at least in the press, or at least expressed by the police, it's probably someone who's never come up as a suspect. It's just a mystery individual out there who was born, lived, had a name, had an identity. People knew who he was, but we have no idea that he is the killer. And even Ira Miller, that guy that every time there was an unsolved case that it went a long time without getting solved, there was always some guy who was, you know, a loser, so to speak. Some guy that was just a transient drunk, a guy with a history of petty crime. There was always at least one of those that the police would snatch up and try to put this whole thing on. And oftentimes they would use brutal methods. The Cleveland torso murder case that happened a little over a decade later, there was a guy that they grabbed on that after years of not finding anyone, and they pretty much gave him the same treatment they gave Ira Miller. And that guy was a, you know, kind of a transient drunk, and they beat him up and got him to confess to it, and then they, you know, he recanted the confession, and they found out later his confession didn't match the facts. There's lots of cases like this where there's that suspect, and there's always somebody that comes up way down the road when the police are desperate to finally find someone responsible. So considering the fact that Ira Miller was apprehended under those types of circumstances, obviously makes me I mean, there was really no evidence that he did it, especially since he wasn't really looked into till over a decade after the crime. He did look like an ape, though, kind of, and that's interesting, but it's not quite evidence.